Welcome to this session on, as part of the UK's changing economy. I just want to reflect, because everything really we can relate to the change in the economy through time in the UK. So if we have a look here, if we go back to 1750, before 1800, say, most people were farmers. And this is before factories, before we started having trains and all of those things. So this is pre-industrial. This is before the before we had our industries. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, and at that point everything took off, and we hit the Industrial Revolution, and it was our industrial era. And for 100 years, the UK really was very instrumental. It was right at the front there. We were burning coal and powering our industries, and had a steel industry, and we were making textiles and shipyards and all of these different things. You know, coal mines were digging up coal to power the power stations, to make all of these amazing things. In the 1970s, something happened. A couple of things happened. Number one, it became cheaper to make these products in other countries, such as China, for example, or in Southeast Asia. So people who owned factories made the choice to go to places where there was cheaper labour. Okay, so China, etc., equals cheaper or cheap labour, and that means you can make your product more cheaply. Now that was true in the past, but in the past the transport of those goods would have been so expensive, but the transport by shipping became much cheaper. The other thing that happened is the factories in 1850 that were modern and amazing, by the 1950s they were looking really out of date. So the UK factories were really out of date. They needed a huge amount of money putting into them. Lots of them were nationalised, so they were owned by the government. We'll come on to that in another section. But the government certainly didn't have enough money for some of these big steel yards and so on to update the machinery. So there was a series, some of these companies were sold off, but the key point here is that the factory closed. Now, we were industrial, and we had deindustrialization. One L. Industrialization. Crikey, long word. Deindustrialization. That's what happened there. So this is what happened. So in the 1970s and into the 1980s, deindustrialization. If you've been in my lesson, you'll have heard me say, if you de-flea the cat, you get rid of the fleas. If you de-industrialise the country, you get rid of many of the factories. Not all of them, but a large number. And a lot of people lost their jobs, and it wasn't a happy time for the UK. Our economy was not in good shape at that time. Now, if we've been pre-industrial, then industrial, we experience deindustrialisation, we then enter the period of post-industrial era, or the post-industrial economy. And this is the economy we would recognise today. Large numbers of people working with computers, with IT. This was the period of time when IT just totally took off. The internet came into being in the 90s and the 2000s, and the world that we have come to know emerged. The jobs here are very different to the jobs here and here. These are in a different sector. So if we just remind ourselves of some key words, farming jobs are what beginning with P? Okay, they're primary employment or primary jobs. Factories, where you make something, that's correct. Secondary jobs. Now, the loss of many secondary jobs meant that a large number of people started working in what kind of jobs, what kind of employment? That's it. Tertiary jobs. So these are people offering a service. So we often call these service, working in the service sector. So I'm a teacher, I'm a tertiary worker. If you work in a shop or an office, or you're a doctor or a healthcare professional, you're a tertiary worker. If you worked in a factory creating something, you're a secondary worker. If you're a farmer or a miner, or if you go, you fish commercially for a living, you're primary. There's another category here which is important in the UK, and that's the quaternary sector, quaternary jobs. And these are jobs in research. So this is often linked to universities, definitely linked to science parks, which we'll come to later on. And this is all part of the post-industrial economy in the UK at the moment. Okay, so we will keep returning to this because many of the key features that we're going to look at through this topic will return back to this idea of our pre-industrial into an industrial era, deindustrialization, and then moving into the current post-industrial economy after industry. Industries have largely gone, and we have a very large number. In fact, I think in 2006 we had 74% of our workers were in the tertiary services sector. So you might have worked in shops or healthcare or education, and 9% quaternary. So these are people developing new drugs, medical drugs, developing new IT. Okay, UK's changing economy. Really important, and we'll keep coming back to this.